Good evening and welcome to Chicago Tonight. I'm Paris Schutz.
And I'm Amanda Vinicky. Brandis Friedman is on assignment. On the show tonight, new witness testimony in R. Kelly's Chicago trial says the star paid out hundreds of thousands of dollars to recover a sex tape with a minor. We share the latest.
There you go. It's now law.
Local members of Congress on the impact of the Inflation Reduction Act, canceling student loan debt, and much more.
There's hot and there's really hot. A study suggests Illinois will soon be part of an extreme heat belt.
Decades later, former and current residents of West Chicago are still dealing with the environmental hazards caused by industrial pollution in that community.
There's big news about the solar system's biggest planet. A local astronomer helps us process stunning new images of Jupiter.
And vending machines filled with art and other goodies. Meet the makers behind an effort to support local artists. But first, some more of today's top stories. A man has been charged in a hit and run that killed 3 men and injured a 4th outside the Jeffrey Pub in the South Shore neighborhood. Chicago Police Superintendent David Brown says 34-year-old Tavis Dunbar has been charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted first-degree murder.
This senseless act of violence won't be tolerated in the city of Chicago. And this arrest was the result of hard work done by the men and women of the Chicago Police Department and true community collaboration. From the beginning, community members stepped forward and spoke up to help us hold this offender accountable.
Brown says Dunbar surrendered to police Monday after he was identified as the alleged driver of the car who intentionally struck the victims. Mayor Lori Lightfoot is declining to endorse the recommendation from a commission she created that 13 monuments be removed, including the city's 3 statues of Christopher Columbus. The commission, which was formed more than 2 years ago in the wake of social justice protests, also recommends that the city remove the Italo Balbo monument and several other monuments and reliefs because of the way they depict Native Americans.
I'm not going to sit here and tell you that I agree with everything that was recommended. I don't, and I've been pretty clear about that. But it's easier to say this should go, that should go, than make it happen. For example, the reliefs that are on the Fort Dearborn Bridge, easier to say, let's remove these because they don't accurately reflect the true experience of Native Americans in our country and in our city. But just the mechanics of doing that are very, very complicated.
No specifics on those Columbus statues, however, and you can read the commission's full report on our website. Arlington Heights residents support the Chicago Bears coming to their area, but oppose any tax subsidy to help the team pay for it. The poll surveyed 300 registered voters and found 72% of respondents support the Bears' proposal to build a stadium at the former Arlington International Racecourse, but almost as many, 68%, oppose using tax dollars to subsidize the move. The poll also found strong support for an ordinance to prohibit Arlington Heights from using taxpayer funds to help build a stadium for the Bears. And up next, new witness testimony in R. Kelly's Chicago trial, so please stay with us.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by Alexandra and John Nichols, the Jim and Kay Mabee family, the Polk Brothers Foundation, and the support of these donors.
A former associate of R. Kelly says the R&B star repeatedly paid him hundreds of thousands of dollars to recover an illicit sex tape the singer allegedly filmed himself. That was part of new witness testimony today in R. Kelly's federal child pornography trial in Chicago. WTTW news reporter Matt Masterson has been following the case and joins us now with more. Matt, remind us what R. Kelly is charged with and what today's new testimony was about.
So R. Kelly, he's facing more than a dozen charges, including production of child pornography, conspiracy to receive child pornography, child enticement, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. So much of the testimony in today's hearing had to do with that alleged conspiracy to obstruct justice. Charles Freeman, a former associate and friend of Kelly's, testified that he was contracted by one of the singer's co-defendants, Daryl McDavid, and another man to recover this VHS tape that Kelly had allegedly produced himself in sexually abusing a 14-year-old girl in the 1990s. And Freeman detailed how he did get the tape back. He made copies of it as a form of insurance in case Kelly didn't pay him the $1 million that he asked for to get this tape back, and the lengths he went through to get that payment over the ensuing years.
So it seems to prove that Kelly knew that this was wrong.
That's what the prosecution would like to believe. Now, Kelly's attorneys have portrayed this associate, Charles Freeman, as a liar and a con man. So they would like to say that all he is just making this up to make himself look better.
Now, Matt, today was the 7th day of this trial. Can you summarize what we've learned so far?
So the key testimony for the prosecution so far was a woman using the pseudonym Jane, and she was allegedly this 14-year-old girl who was in this tape that Freeman was contracted to recover. She testified last week that Kelly sexually abused her hundreds of times while she was still a minor in the 1990s. And those tapes were also at the heart of Kelly's 2008 child porn trial here in Cook County. But this woman, Jane, didn't testify at that trial, and he was ultimately acquitted. And this week, Jane's mother testified that her family felt so threatened by Kelly that they actually feared for their lives.
And Matt, this trial is expected to go about 3 weeks, so a lot more left. What can we expect in coming days?
Yeah, we're expected to go about a month, so there's a lot of testimony left. Charles Freeman's going to continue his testimony tomorrow. There's going to be cross-examination of some of his claims. And prosecutors said they expect to call another victim who was a minor who says she was also sexually abused by Kelly sometime later this week.
Well, thanks so much for sharing all of that with us, Matt.
Thanks, Amanda.
You can read Matt's full story on our website. That's WTTW.com/news. And now to Paris with local members of Congress. Paris.
Amanda, it was a congressional compromise few saw coming. But last week, President Joe Biden signed the Inflation Reduction Act, a sweeping climate and health care bill, into law. So when will Americans start to feel effects of this new law? Here to talk about that and much more are Congressman Mike Quigley, a Democrat from Chicago's North Side, Congressman Raja Krishnamurthy, a Democrat from Schaumburg, and Congressman Sean Casten, a Democrat from Downers Grove. We also invited all the Republicans in Illinois' congressional delegation, and none accepted our invitation for tonight. But we do thank you all for being back here with us. Before we get to the Inflation Reduction Act, Congressman Quigley, President Biden is expected to make an announcement tomorrow about canceling student loan debt up to $10,000. Whether or not he's going to do that, what do you think he's going to announce?
I think that's exactly what he's going to announce. I don't have any pre-knowledge, but, for too long, young and old Americans have been held back from the American dream. There's more student loan debt than credit card debt. So they can't buy a car, they can't buy a house. This will be a huge hand up to lower and middle class Americans. About 15 million Americans will get a real benefit from this act.
Congressman Casten, there is an argument within the party and without that it benefits those that might be earning decent incomes at the expense of those who didn't go to college and perhaps earn less. What about that?
Well, I think we're all waiting to see exactly what the president says. My understanding is that he is intending to tailor it to preferentially apply to folks at the lower end of the income scale. But I think it's worth noting that we have $1.7 trillion of student loan debt that is due to the American government right now. And whenever Jay Powell comes before a Financial Services Committee, he says you probably shouldn't count that as an asset because a good chunk of it is not going to be repaid. We don't gain anything as a society when we leave people indebted for an obligation that the chairman of the Federal Reserve says a good chunk of that we're probably not going to collect. So I'd argue that it's the net positive is much greater on our society if we find ways, as Congressman Quigley said, to free up those people so that they can buy a home, invest, start a business. And as I said, we'll wait to see exactly what the details are of the president's plan tomorrow.
And as you said, it's expected to be tailored to those perhaps on the lower end of the income scale. Congressman Krishnamurthy, former Treasury Secretary Lawrence Summers says he believes that it could exacerbate inflation by putting this much money back into folks' pockets. What about that argument?
Well, I'd like to see how it's structured and how it ends up getting administered. But I think that the one thing that I would just say is that a lot of people are held back in kind of starting ventures that could produce more goods and supplies for our economy, thereby, basically increasing supply and lowering prices of certain goods and services because they're held back by their student debt. So I think that this could be a net positive in the long term on this particular issue. But again, we'll have to see what the details are when they're announced.
And we'll await the president's news briefing on that tomorrow. Congressman Quigley, on this Inflation Reduction Act, deals with climate change, it deals with health care. On that health care bit, the government can now negotiate top drug prices, cap on insulin prices, out-of-pocket for Medicare recipients. When are Americans going to start to feel these benefits?
Look, on the act as a whole, on the climate side, right away, those tax incentives are going to go into effect right now as the president has signed the law. So that's going to help with people purchasing solar panels, energy efficient devices, electric vehicles. It's going to help companies too. Just a few examples. You upgrade your breaker box, it's up to a $4,000 rebate, $2,500 for electric wiring. This will be an extraordinary incentive to move to 40% reduction in emissions by 2030. That starts right now.
Congressman Caston, on those tax incentives, climate change has been a big concern of yours in Congress. There are already reports that that $7,000 or so rebate for electric vehicles might be offset if automakers raise the price. Do you worry that things like that might happen?
No, look, I trust markets that are eventually going to compete on that price. The $7,000 deduction that you talk, we should clarify that it's basically about half of that you can get, and the balance is going to depend on having domestic content. And we actually just saw earlier this week, Hyundai announced that they are going to accelerate the construction of a U.S. EV plant because they want to be in place in manufacturing in the United States in time to capture that whole credit. And furthermore, that credit is tailored, much as the student loan debt, it's tailored towards folks at the lower income levels. So I think you have to have less than $150,000 of individual income, or don't quote me, I think it's $225,000 of household income in order to qualify for the credit. So the credit's not really going to target people who are buying $200,000 cars. They're targeting people who are in that Chevy Bolt, the Hyundai range that's coming on. And everything that I've seen is that this is going to accelerate a trend that's already underway to bring a lot more EVs on the market and more consumer choice.
And the idea here is to start to move those markets to renewables. Congressman Krishnamurthy, do you believe this bill can help reduce emissions globally to the point that they need to be to stop the warming that's going on 2 degrees or more over the next several years?
Well, it's going to make a significant step in the right direction. Obviously, it's going to require concerted action by countries other than the United States joining with us. However, for instance, President Biden had announced that he wanted to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the United States by 50% since 2005 levels. And with this Inflation Reduction Act, we're going to get to roughly 40% below 2005 levels. So a significant way to the goal. I do think that this is going to allow us to use this topic as an icebreaker, if you will, with other countries to get them off the sidelines to do more than they're currently doing to get us to the goal that we all wanted as part of the Paris Climate Change Accord. One last point I want to say, my bill, which incentivizes the creation of solar panels, solar components, and other products to be built in the United States, was included as part of the Inflation Reduction Act. I'm really excited about that because at the end of the day, we want to create wealth and prosperity from the solar and renewable energy revolution here in the U.S. And so those manufacturing credits are going into place starting in January of next year.
All right, so your bill folded into this overall bill. Congressman Quigley, as we've said many times today, it is called the Inflation Reduction Act. How exactly does it reduce inflation?
Well, look, I mean, it helps people adjust with fixed costs. I mean, there's not a member of Congress that doesn't go home and talk to senior citizens who have tough choices to make on prescription drugs, right? They either pay their bills or they buy their medicine for that week or that month. So when they cap it at $2,000, that is going to be a game changer. When they allow them to negotiate for prescription drug pricing, Medicare, that's going to be a game changer. It's going to dramatically reduce the cost, particularly for those, as my colleagues have talked about, on lower incomes, on fixed incomes. It's going to help those who are impacted by inflation the most in the shortest period of time.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there for right now, but we will be joined again by the Congress members later in the program to discuss the midterm elections and that raid on Mar-a-Lago you might have heard about. But for now, our thanks to Representatives Mike Quigley, Raja Krishnamurthy, and Sean Casten. And now to Amanda and concerns about extreme weather. Amanda.
Thanks, Paris. Illinois will soon be part of a cluster of states in an extreme heat belt. That's according to a recent study that finds a quarter of land in the U.S. is at risk of the most extreme levels of heat exposure. That's temperatures exceeding a 125-degree heat index. Joining us are Matthew Eby, the CEO of the First Street Foundation. The nonprofit measures climate-related risks and conducted the hazardous heat study. And Scott Collis, an atmospheric scientist and department head at the Argonne National Laboratory. Now, thanks so much. We're going to begin by looking at a graphic that's from this report. It compares predicted temperatures in 2023, so just next year, to 30 years from now, 2053, showing the increase of these extreme heat days. Matthew, what are exactly extreme heat days? How did you measure that?
So in an extreme heat, we are talking about what is the maximum temperature you would expect in any given year. And currently, there's only about 7 million Americans living in different pockets around the country that would experience a level of heat above 125 degrees. But what we're forecasting with emissions and the change from climate change overall is that that extreme heat belt actually then grows and encompasses areas all the way from the top of Texas and Louisiana through and up to Chicago, where we would expect every year at least one day over 125 degrees in the local area.
Not a swath that we want to be part of. I believe something like 107 million Americans will be part of that group in the next 30 years. And that is a population like 8 times the size of Illinois. So, Scott, would you see this? What is your reaction?
Well, it's another way of painting a picture we've already seen, but with increased resolution and increased fidelity. Basically, pumping greenhouse gases into the atmosphere is going to warm the atmosphere. But in places where most people live, which is where we have so much asphalt, black roofs, cities like Chicago are going to be impacted even more.
You're saying cities like Chicago because there's pavement, there's the buildings, and so it just changes the equation?
Yeah, so the great work that Matt and others have done is they've taken the normal course climate model that we're used to dealing with. It's like looking at an old pixelated digital camera, and they've zoomed it in to that extremely high resolution, really focusing on the resolutions where people live who are impacted by climate change. And in our cities, especially in poorer areas where you've got, less air conditioning and less ability to deal with climate change, those are the areas that are going to be impacted the most.
Now, Matthew, what exactly is driving this heat belt, particularly as it goes so far north into Indiana, into Illinois? We know that the southern states have gotten particularly hot, but why so far north?
Yeah, it's really interesting. As Scott was just going through, it's a mixture of components that all come together to then give you that localized heat. So what we're seeing up north that we don't see in the south is really a proximity to water. So when the wind brings that cooling temperature from the water into land, it actually resists the temperatures from getting too hot. And so places like Florida and Louisiana that you would automatically expect to achieve those extreme temperatures are almost naturally protected from those upper bounds. But then when you look at the elevation and where the wind comes from towards places like Chicago, they don't have that cooling effect. And then you end up with those added elements of having things like impervious surfaces, things like steel or concrete that actually absorb heat and get hotter than the surrounding air around it. And that's when you end up with these extreme temperatures.
Now, Matthew, it's summer, and it's supposed to be hot in this summer in places like Chicago. So what is the difference between, all right, just uncomfortable and these extreme and hazardous heats?
Sure. So there's a couple different ways of thinking about it. When you think of a heat index, it's a mixture of humidity and absolute temperatures. And that's very important because your body, as it perspires, as it sweats, that's how it naturally cools. But when you end up in these feels-like temperatures that get so hot, your ability to regulate your temperature and stay cool
starts to decrease. And so you end up with what are called dangerous days from the National Weather Service, which are 103 degrees or hotter, or at the highest point, the extremely dangerous days over 125, which is what we're seeing. And at those temperatures, you end up with things like heat stroke is very likely, or you end up with things like critical infrastructure. So steel, like I was talking about, absorbs that heat and gets very hot. Things like rail tracks are so hot that when you have a big, heavy train go on them, they can kink and buckle and cause trains to derail. So everything from personal health to infrastructure starts to change and react differently.
Scott, so we sort of heard Matthew touch on that there in terms of the impact on public health, infrastructure. Is there anything that you want to add about the impact of that? I'm thinking, for example, Illinois, we've got a whole lot of agricultural territory.
Yeah, and that's what we're really interested in studying at places like Argonne and the Department of Energy, is the impact on areas that are fairly uniform, like agriculture and stuff like that. We saw the derecho, we saw those storms that can get going just because of the extra energy, because of the extra water vapor in the atmosphere. But, what we're really interested in looking at is measuring and understanding how climate interacts at that street level. And so Matt's group has done a lot of work in taking the course data and making it high resolution. What we're really interested in doing is taking the measurements to understand how the weather and climate interact with the city, because there's this two-way feedback. You have the city changes the climate, but also the climate can actually change the way the city is working as well.
Well, and to that end, let's put up actually a map from this study that details the amount of consecutive days above 100 degrees in Illinois, with downstate getting hit the hardest. So, Scott, are we already seeing the impacts of climate change in Illinois and Chicago? I'm thinking flooding.
Absolutely. So recently, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration released what they call their 20-year normals. They look at the average temperature over and precipitation over 20 years, because it's kind of like, what do I expect my average temperature to be? So they move from one 20-year normal, they look 10 years down the track of the new 20-year normals. We can see climate change there. Chicago is becoming wetter, but we're getting more of our rainfall all at once, more flash drought, more flash flood, and Chicago is getting hotter.
And so a lot of more to talk about in terms of how we need to prepare for that and any potential prevention. We'll have to save that for another day. For now, our thanks to Matthew Eby and Scott Collis.
Always a pleasure.
Up next, a look inside a new effort to help local artists sell their creations. Stay with us.
Much of the story of Latinos in America is that of entrepreneurship. About 5 million Latino-owned businesses currently exist in the U.S.
Predominantly Latino communities often bear the environmental burden of heavy industry. Residents of those communities say they have a hard time making their concerns heard.
A Chicago-based photographer has a personal understanding of immigration, and he has spent years documenting small businesses.
The forces of gentrification can make people being priced out of their neighborhoods feel powerless. But the founders of Lolita's Bodega say residents have more power than they think.
There's much more ahead on the program, including dazzling new pictures of Jupiter from the Webb telescope. But first, it is a kind of art gallery inside. It's kind of an art gallery inside a vending machine. There's a new effort to boost the profile of artists and makers in Chicago and put some money in their pockets. Producer Mark Vitale has a look at the lighter side of buying artwork and other fun stuff, sometimes to just go along with your beer.
At Metropolitan Brewing in Avondale and the Chicago Cultural Center in the Loop, repurposed vending machines are stocked with vintage paperbacks, novelties, and art. We scored a signed print for $15. The machines are owned and operated by the local company Good Things Vending.
Good Things Vending is a creative vending machine project. It stocks local art, vintage and nostalgia items, and practical corner store type stuff. I'll try pretty much anything within the constraints of the machine. So there's a price restriction, which is $1 to $20, and there is a size restriction. It needs to be about the size of a bag of chips or about the size of a candy bar.
Products might include a game of bird bingo, jewelry, or embroidered patches. And Steph Krim says business is booming, with machines needing to be restocked weekly.
I went to the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and the thing that I really learned there is that what makes any education, any community beautiful are all the people that are involved in contributing.
The vending machines themselves are a canvas for local artists commissioned to paint them. And the items within are tailored to the audience. At the Cultural Center, for example, things are more family-friendly. But you have to visit the brewery if you want a locally made pin that identifies you as a cheese slut.
I love when people reach out to collaborate, especially when they come to it with ideas that break outside of what I've done before, because it's its own little satellite retail moment that doesn't really have the same sorts of rules that like a brick and mortar shop would, so we can get pretty playful. Jake?
One collaborator is Hannah Sellers, the creator of Cat Drool, coloring books, and more.
The Cat Drool is my art practice that was born out of the pandemic. I'm a designer by trade, and so doing Cat Drool just allows me to like set down a lot of the rules of design and just like process my emotions and my life. And it's called Cat Drool because my cat drools when he's happy. It totally gives my art a different form and shape, and also gives me a different venue. Like I would never have my art at Metropolitan Brewing. And I'm still floored that people buy them. Like Steph will be like, your row sold out again. And I'm like, what do you mean? Like someone bought my sticker pack of my cat, like drooling, like, I don't know.
The machines accept cash or plastic, and profits are divvied up.
Right now, the way that it's set up is that artist goods are in the machine on consignment. It's 60-40 in favor of the artist. If items are really successful and I have trouble keeping them stocked, sometimes I'll purchase work wholesale. Joy, that's the thing that I feel most, because that person that decided to walk up, they're probably into what I'm into. And seeing somebody do something like open a grab bag or check out a new artist product while hanging here, those types of things make me feel like the project really comes to life.
For Chicago Tonight, this is Mark Vitale.
What a fun concept. Good Things vending machines can be found at the Chicago Cultural Center and Metropolitan Brewing. A third machine is set to be installed at the Way Out Bar in Logan Square next month. You can find out more on their Instagram page via our website. And now we go back to Amanda.
Thanks, Ferris. Still to come on Chicago Tonight, reports that former President Trump took 700 pages of classified documents to his Florida home. Local members of Congress weigh in. Former West Chicago residents feel the impact of hazardous waste left behind by a chemical corporation decades ago. And big news about the solar system's biggest planet. A local astronomer helps us process the Webb telescope's new images of Jupiter. But first, some more of today's top stories. A Chicago police officer charged with participating in the January 6th insurrection while wearing a Chicago Police Department sweatshirt is set to stand trial May 1st. 30-year-old Carol Schweziak rejected an offer from federal prosecutors to plead guilty to a single charge. That agreement would have meant a maximum 6-month prison term. Schweziak sent pictures of himself from outside the Capitol and inside the office of Senator Jeff Merkley, which got trashed, according to court records. Schweziak is facing 5 misdemeanor charges, including disorderly conduct, disrupting government business, and entering a restricted building. He was stripped of his police powers and charged in June of last year. Most American adults want to see gun laws made stricter. That's according to a new poll from the University of Chicago and the Associated Press, which shows 71% of Americans say gun laws should be tightened. That figure includes about half of Republicans, the vast majority of Democrats, and a majority of adults in gun-owning households. The poll was conducted between July 28th and August 1st after a string of deadly mass shootings, including the attack on the July 4th parade in Highland Park. The defending WNBA champions are hoping to move on to the next round of the playoffs. To do that, the Chicago Sky will have to beat the New York Liberty in tonight's win-or-go-home Game 3. After a loss in the series opener, the Sky dominated New York to win by 38 points on Saturday. That's the largest margin of victory in WNBA playoff history. If the Sky win tonight, the team will go on to face either the Dallas Wings or the Connecticut Sun. That series is also tied with Game 3 tomorrow. And now, Paris, we toss it back to you.
Thanks, Amanda. Earlier in the program, we discussed the student loan debt and the Inflation Reduction Act. And now we're joined again by Congressman Mike Quigley, Raja Krishnamurthy, and Sean Casten. Again, we invited all the Republicans in Illinois' congressional delegation. None accepted our invitation for tonight. And again, we do thank you for being back with us. Congressman Casten, on a different issue, the issue of gun violence, the AP has a poll showing that 71% of Americans think gun laws should be stricter. The House did pass an assault weapons ban. Any chance at all in the Senate, or no?
No, I think what really troubles us all in the House is the things that the majority of the American people want have a very hard time passing the Senate. We can't get the Senate to take up a vote on an assault weapons ban because they're prioritizing the filibuster over people's lives. And so I think we're very troubled by that. But I think we can show in the House what's possible, not just on assault weapons bans, but domestic violence protections, the trying to figure out how to get more guns off the street. Keep in mind, the majority of gun deaths in this country are by suicide. And the majority of mass shooters are young white men with a history of domestic violence. 2/3 of all mass shooters have a history of domestic violence. If 2/3 of all car fatalities happened in one type of car, we'd take that car off the road. We passed a bill in the House to take guns away from domestic violence abusers. There's a small, limited takeaway from the Senate package, but we need to do more. As I said in my town hall on gun violence last week, ultimately we're going to be judged not by what we passed, but by whether the number of gun deaths in this country is declining, and so far we are not succeeding.
And a lot of things passed the House on many issues, like voter protection, gun rights that do not seem to get any momentum in the Senate. Congressman Krishnamurthy, there are some other ideas out there. One from Representative Carolyn Maloney from New York would impose a 20% tax on the total revenue for assault weapons manufacturers or importers. Is that something that your colleagues are talking about?
They're talking about it. We're trying to figure out ways that we can, limit the access to these weapons of war, these AR-15 and assault-style weapons. I actually had the chance to question gun company CEOs at an oversight hearing chaired by Carolyn Maloney. And what we found is that the gun companies made $1 billion off the sale of these AR-15 weapons over just the last 10 years. And so it's a huge moneymaker for them. And so is it any wonder that they and the NRA are against banning the sale of these weapons? Not to me, it isn't. And yet the vast majority of Americans don't believe that everyone should have access to these AR-15s. They say ban the sale of them, raise the minimum age for purchasing them, prevent domestic abusers from getting access to any weapons. And yet the gun company CEOs and the NRA are against it for profits, and they're putting profits over people's lives.
And it seems like they have some outsized influence every time these issues come up, although we should mention the modest gun bill that did clear the House and Senate and signed by President Biden. Congressman Quigley, let's move over to this Trump raid. According to a letter from the National Archives, former President Trump had taken 700 pages of classified documents to Mar-a-Lago. These are records that the National Archives have sought. The DOJ got involved. They subpoenaed for them. They took some of them, then discovered there were more left over that the Trump lawyers were apparently not forthcoming about. Then they got more with the search warrant. How serious a potential criminal investigation is this?
Look, it doesn't get more serious. And the fact that the Attorney General himself was personally involved in its approval tells you that they're being very careful. I'm sure the FBI was when they conducted this raid. Raja and I serve on the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. This information, discussed as it was, as top secret, and with the letters that go with it, that is the most important information to keep safe. And the language they tell us is that our national security would be gravely impacted upon its release. Why any former president would want this is mind-boggling and particularly scary. And his reaction to this in the typical bluster is as concerning because of the threats that it connotates. And we're already seeing some of the beginnings of the violence that it will create.
And Congressman Krishnamurthy, being on the House Select Committee on Intelligence, are you privy to any of the specifics of what these classified documents might contain and how concerning they might be to national security?
Well, we've actually written a letter to Avril Haines, the Director of National Intelligence, requesting information about the contents as well as, most importantly, damage to our national security by potential exposure of those documents, God forbid, to our adversaries. I just want to echo something that Mike said, which is that, you know, when we see these documents, especially the ones that are marked, like, for instance, TSSCI, for instance, which is the most exquisite, most precious, the crown jewels of our intelligence community, you know, these are only reviewed within bunkers that are under armed guard. And people take inventory of these particular materials, even as we're reviewing them, and then they take them back upon our completion of our review. The fact that they would be out of a secure facility in the basement of Mar-a-Lago, potentially exposed to visitors or potentially our adversaries, is very disturbing, especially given that the Espionage Act was invoked in the warrant for the collection of those documents. The Espionage Act there has to do with defense-related information. So when you're talking about top secret information related to our national defense, that's what raises everybody's eyebrows and more, and that's why we have to get to the bottom of what's in these documents and get them back.
Also raising everyone's eyebrows, threats against the FBI. Congressman Casten, are you concerned about some of what the FBI is facing either here locally in Chicago offices or around the country?
I think we're quite concerned. I think you may have seen the story today that the IRS agents are now also saying that there's threats there. There's a real question here that we have to ask ourselves as Americans, not as Democrats or Republicans. Do we believe that we are a country that is bound by the rule of law and that the law applies equally to all? And there are obviously, you know, some of our colleagues who were chanting about, you know, supporting law enforcement not that long ago are now calling to defund the FBI, not because, you know, their views changed, but because they didn't like it when people who were their friends apparently broke the law and had been prosecuted. And either you defend the rule of law or you are a party to the demise of our democracy. And it is dangerous for the risks it's placing on our law enforcement officers because of some of the rhetoric coming out of the senior leadership of the Republican Party. It is dangerous for public safety because if we are not protected by these individuals, then our communities aren't safe. But ultimately, it's dangerous for the viability of our democracy. And I strongly hope that the leadership of the Republican Party will start tempering down this rhetoric and putting democracy and rule of law first. And I'm not encouraged that they are going to do that anytime soon. And frankly, I'm scared.
And indeed, some members have. Former Vice President Mike Pence has called it some, but the vast majority have either stayed silent or maybe supported some of that rhetoric. We're going to have to leave it there. A lot to cover here. Our thanks to Congressman Mike Quigley, Raja Krishnamurthy, and Sean Casten. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And up next, the impact of hazardous waste left behind by a chemical corporation. But first, we take a look at the weather. The trial for a class action lawsuit against Sterigenics is now underway. That's the Willowbrook company accused of releasing a cancer-causing waste in DuPage County. Long before that Sterigenics case, residents in the suburb of West Chicago struggled with health issues stemming from the mismanagement of toxic waste in that community. A former polluter claimed responsibility in 1980, and the hazardous waste was finally removed in 2015. But the health issues remain. And joining us are Erica Bartlett, former West Chicago resident and cancer survivor, Ted Hogan, a PhD in public health and associate professor at Northern Illinois University, focusing on chemical health hazards and control measures. He's a former West Chicago resident. and Julieta Alcantar Garcia, a community organizer and official of Immigrant Solidarity DuPage, who was born and raised in West Chicago. Welcome all of you to Chicago Tonight. Ted Hogan, you spent the first years of your life in West Chicago. Can you give us a brief history of the toxic contaminants that were found all over that community?
Good evening. Yes, there was a plant that was a rare earth plant. You've read about and seen a lot of coverage of rare earth mining taking place. They're used in lots of electronic devices. But one of the largest rare earth plants in the world was in West Chicago, of all places. And the material they left behind was a radioactive waste, and it included radioactive thorium, among others. It polluted the local park area next to the park where I used to play as a kid. And then also it was distributed as a landfill for houses throughout the town. Over 600 houses had to be, the property had to be remediated because of that.
So houses, residents in West Chicago were actually taking some of this toxic material and putting it into their yards and into their grounds. Erica Bartlett, as we mentioned, you're a cancer survivor. You strongly believe that it is linked to the radioactive pollution in West Chicago, and then you went and knocked on some doors of neighbors to find out their situation. What did you find?
Well, when I first talked to people, I wasn't really sure if I would find any connection. But the more people I talked to, the more clear it was to me that there was kind of a pattern I was seeing with what seemed to be high incidence of cancer in the areas surrounding the factory and the polluted sites in the town. And it was very humbling to hear all the different stories and how the different people were impacted by this. And a lot of it was really sad to hear. Some of the people weren't necessarily aware of the whole story or why it was there. And that was concerning to me.
And Ms. Alcantar Garcia, you're one of the residents. You're born and raised in West Chicago. Many Latinos began moving there a few decades ago, and they were not aware of the extent of the environmental damage that existed there. How come so many people were in the dark for so long, and then how did they start finding out?
Well, I blame the language barrier because most of these people did not know English. This was subsequent to a mushroom farm that sold its homes they had for these people. And coincidentally, there were homes for sale in another area in town. And these people were told you could buy homes here, and I believe they were really economic homes for them. So there was no disclosure. There was nothing telling them that there any warnings. I believe, you know, the realtor, real estate regulations weren't as specific or precise about, disclosing what a home has before you buy it. And today we do have those laws, but I think before 1975 or 1980 wasn't that way. And unfortunately, these people did not know what was in their home. And most of them were Latinos, were people that my parents knew and developed cancers that we were, my father, my mother who passed away a few years ago, they were astonished at people they knew and had passed away or had developed a cancer they never heard of or an illness they never heard of.
So tragic connection here. And Ted Hogan, we should mention that the company at the center of this, a company called Kerr-McGee, as I understand, it's not around anymore. This has been a decades-long fight now to clean up this mess in the community. What is the status right now?
From what I understand is that most of the solid waste material has been taken away, but there is some potential groundwater contamination associated with the site. And it wasn't just in the town. They had to dig up the DuPage River for a number of miles to remove the contamination from the sediment in the soil too. So there may be some groundwater contamination. From what I understand, that their wells are not reaching that area right now. But again, radiation stays around for a very long time, and people don't want that in their neighborhood.
Yeah, and as we mentioned, it's taken decades to clean up, and we spoke with a representative from the state environmental agency that said there's still mitigation going on now. Erica Bartlett, there was a settlement with Kerr-McGee for about $4,000 to kids that grew up in West Chicago. Is that sufficient? I mean, has that company been held accountable enough in your estimation, given the damage and the health issues that it caused?
Well, what was interesting about that particular lawsuit was that it was the first lawsuit in the country providing money for medical monitoring. So you didn't even have to be sick. They were setting the money aside just to kind of have checkups and keep up with your health and try to, I guess, catch any health concerns or problems early. But in reality, when you have something, $4,000 doesn't last a day.
Especially with medical bills, if you are dealing with some kind of chronic illness or cancer. Julieta Alcantar-Garcia, give us a synopsis of how arduous this fight has been and how long it's taken to clean up the community. I believe the image might have frozen there. So Erica Bartlett, I'll throw that question to you. And as I understand, you no longer live there, but how we saw in researching this, we had footage from WTTW way back in 1990 on this, so going back 30 years. So how hard and long a fight has this been?
Well, some of this fight happened when I was still just a kid. There was a group called TAG, which is a Thorium Action Group, and they kind of formed when they found out that Kerr-McGee intended to bury the waste in our town.
And thorium is one of the radioactive compounds, just to clarify. Okay, go ahead.
Yes. So that group kind of formed to fight that, and they got a lot of support from the town, a lot of support from different government agencies, and they actually were able to prevent Kerr-McGee from dumping and burying all that waste in West Chicago. So that was kind of a big victory for them, and that was kind of, I think, where the fight started.
And Julieta, before we lost you, the question to you was just give us a sense of how long and tough this fight has been.
Too long. It is still going on because there's still so much work to do. The situation with the water, we are also trying to look into that ourselves at the Immigrant Solidarity page, because there's still something going on, and there's people sick. There are people sick in West Chicago, and I don't believe $4,000 a few years ago is enough.
And especially, go ahead.
And I would like to see, and I hope my fellow West Chicagoans want to see this resolved and transparency from our municipal government towards West Chicagoans. Speak up, talk to us, and listen to us.
So this, again, a case that's been going on for so many decades, as we see the Sterigenics case in Willowbrook playing out in court right now. And we'll have to leave it there. Our thanks to Erica Bartlett, Ted Hogan, and Julieta Alcantar-Garcia. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us. Bye-bye.
And up next, breathtaking new pictures of Jupiter. So please stay with us.
Coverage of science and technology on Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by Joel M. Friedman, president of the Alvin H. Baum Family Fund.
Giant news from the giant planet. We're talking about new images from NASA of Jupiter, captured by the James Webb Telescope, the largest and most powerful space telescope ever built. The $10 billion telescope is an international collaboration led by NASA alongside the European and Canadian space agencies. These new photos capture the solar system's largest planet in ways we've never seen before. Here to share his insights and enthusiasm is astronomer Mark Hammergren, previously with Adler Planetarium, now an independent science and technology consultant with Farther Horizons. Okay, Mark, these pictures, they are stunning, out of this world even. First impressions, what excites you most?
First impression, wow, this is amazing. These images show Jupiter in more detail in different bands of light, different colors of light than have been observed before. So whenever you observe something in more detail or in a different way, you learn new things.
Especially something all that far away, large though it is. Now, one thing dramatically on display in these is Jupiter's Great Red Spot. Now, that is a storm that's large enough to swallow Earth. Tell us more what you see.
Yeah, so the Great Red Spot, of course, jumps out right away, and it's very bright, which means appropriately for a storm that it has these high-altitude clouds around it. And those clouds have a haze over them, so they reflect more light. Despite the fact that this telescope, the JWST, observes in the infrared, this image is composed of reflected sunlight rather than emitted heat. So what we're seeing is reflected light. We've got the atmosphere of Jupiter. You've got two moons of Jupiter appearing in this image as well. And you've got the aurora at the north and south poles of Jupiter. Plus, I think is really cool, background galaxies. As a photography geek and an astronomy professional, I think it's fantastic that you have this incredible contrast in this single image.
And also faint rings and moons within those rings, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So Adrastea, which is a small moon, maybe only about 10 miles across, it resides in Jupiter's rings. And why is that the case? That's because Adrastea gets knocked by stuff, micrometeorites, that kind of stuff, which blast debris off of that satellite. And they go into orbit around Jupiter. And that's what forms primarily the rings of Jupiter.
So interesting. Now, also interesting, though, is how this came about, because the Webb telescope, powerful, but turning what it captures into images, I mean, this isn't as simple as, I don't know, taking a photo and then getting film processed at Walgreens. So what is involved with producing and really translating these into images?
Well, many steps have to take place. First of all, you get the raw data in, then you have to calibrate them. And you have to take care of errors. The space telescope, JWST, is in space, so it gets hit with cosmic rays, and those cause little artifacts in the images. You've got to take care of those before you can have a pretty picture. You combine the different wavelengths, the different colors of light, and try to make a pretty picture. But then you got something dominated by the bright Jupiter. So then you got to work some magic, really, to bring out the details that you want to see. And this was done by an amateur scientist, a citizen scientist, not an astronomy professional, not even someone who is, expert in photography who was pulled in for this. This is someone who loves the field and produced these gorgeous images and hundreds and hundreds of others.
So literally processing those images, did beautiful work. Now, we did, however, get the first images from the Webb telescope last month, and that included some planetary nebula and a quintet of galaxies. What did you think of those images?
Gorgeous as well. And the view in the infrared light, again, gives us a view that we haven't had before in this kind of detail. What we see in those two images are highlights of cooler material than we've seen optically. Optically, visually, we can see stars and the combined light of billions and billions of stars in these galaxies. But galaxies and this planetary nebula that was featured also have dust in them, condensed star stuff. And that is very hard to observe, but it glows with its own heat. And that can be seen in the infrared in these images. Tells us a completely different story about what's going on in them.
Star stuff. So you pointed out just there an example of something that we've learned from the Webb telescope versus its predecessor, the Hubble and other ground telescopes. So just in general, $10 billion, is it $10 billion better?
Oh, gosh. How does one assign a cost to something like this? Well, to some extent, all of this kind of basic science is a luxury to humans. But then again, so are movies, so are books of almost any kind. Humans don't live just by bread alone. Humans are curious, and these kinds of discoveries really are what give humanity a hope for the future, I think.
And so speaking of about 30 seconds left, what do you hope NASA focuses on and that the Webb is used for next?
I'm primarily a planetary astronomer, so I'm really happy to see that Jupiter is getting its due here. Now, asteroids are also going to be imaged, including the distant solar system. But Hubble, or rather, JWST, is going to be focusing on the distant universe, telling us more about the early stages of our universe, and also forming star systems. And forming star systems, planetary systems, that's what I think will really be cool.
Well, very cool, all of it. Thank you so much to Mark Hammergren.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And we're back to wrap things up right after this.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by Alexandra and John Nichols, the Jim and Kay Mabey family, the Polk Brothers Foundation, and the support of these donors.
Such cool images, and that is our show for this Tuesday night. Don't forget to stay connected with us by signing up for our daily briefing, and you can get Chicago Tonight streamed on Facebook, YouTube, and our website, WTTW.com/news.
You can also get the show via podcast in the PBS video app, and please join us tomorrow night live at 7.
And now for all of us here at Chicago Tonight, I'm Paris Schutz.
And I'm Amanda Vinicky. Thank you for watching. Stay healthy and safe, and have a good night. Maybe.